All right, Dad, happy Friday. Today is September 13th, and
Friday the 13th.
Friday 13th.
Yeah.
Spooky day. Happy news.
Happy News Day, spooky days. I don't know.
Okay. All right, well, let's start this off. Actually, I think you may have seen this clip. I don't know. I'm going to play you a little clip from,
Okay.
it's a Polish MEP, member of the European Parliament. Um, and he's speaking about Blinken going to Poland after his Kiev visit here. So let's start with
All right.
this.
Blinken, go home. Go home as soon as possible. Get lost. Get lost. We don't want you here. We don't want Polish people paying and dying for your wars. Thank you very much. Blinken.
Nope. Okay. Have you seen that before?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was it was great to see. You know, I always hear about how Poland is in the Baltic states are so gung ho on hating Russia and they want to go after it. And finally, I'm seeing somebody stand up like, yes, maybe we're getting too far, and the threat of World War III is becoming very real in the minds of more and
Right.
more people, especially in places like Poland and the
Right.
Balkans. You know, these people that are the most often previously the most antagonistic towards Russia. It's like you guys are the first ones that are going to lose
Right.
if this
They have the
war
most
breaks
to
out.
lose. Right, exactly. And
So-
it really, and it seems also that they never learn their lessons. It's just that, yeah, you have to make peace with Russia in the end. I mean, you don't have to like them. You can hate them, but you just have to be realistic and understand that it's in your interest to get along with Russia. Now, there always have been tensions between Ukraine and Poland. First there's a lot of the tensions are over the history between them and the role of the Banderites in what's now Western Ukraine and used to be part of Poland, where the Banderites, the followers of Stefan Bandera, killed many Poles. I think we're talking about hundreds of thousands, something like 200,000.
Can you explain a little bit? I know we've done this before.
Yeah.
A little bit about the Banderites, because it's amazing how little people know about the history of Ukraine and why there is this neo-Nazi element in Ukraine, and whereas there's this real division in Ukraine, why we had a civil war in Ukraine, the split between the East and the West.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm not going to go into depth, nor really could I, but I'll just sketch it out. That Stefan Bandera was a nationalist leader, a Ukrainian who rose to power, during the 1930s and made an alliance with Nazi Germany. And when the Germans invaded, when they invaded first Poland, taking it back from the Soviets, and then Ukraine, he actually was. I mean, it was more than an informal alliance. I think they were, they established a formal alliance, worked in coordination with Nazi units, and were responsible for killing great numbers of civilians. I've just mentioned that the 200,000 or so Poles, but Russians, Jews, and then and various leftists and so forth. So, by any, if we apply, the general condemnation of that we now apply to the Nazis and to Nazi collaborators, Stefan Bandera should be, consigned to the deepest circle of hell. And but he is considered a hero within much of Ukraine. It's certainly not all of Ukraine, but in much of Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine. And there are statues to him, there are busts to him. Many of the prominent leaders, of the Kiev government are followers, are admirers of Stefan Bandera. It used to be, well, Zaluzhny, of course, was the head of the armed forces until he was pushed out not too long ago. He's now ambassador to UK, but he's got not just one, but two busts of Stefan Bandera in his office. And you could see him, in some of the interviews. And it's just amazing that again, it's that Western Europe and the U.S. decided just not to talk about this. This was something that was brought up, before 2022. Occasionally, it was brought up. In fact, there was a law passed by Congress, that denied aid to what was then called the Azov Battalion, because of their association with Bandera and with Nazism in general. And then it was all forgotten. And now you're not allowed to bring it up. If you bring it up, you're obviously repeating Putin talking points. But it's real, and it's there. If you go back, I think like 10. The devotion to Stefan Bandera is something that's always been there. I think that's survived even the Soviet years. Obviously it was hidden during that time. There were efforts during the first decade or so after the end of World War II to actually foment rebellion. These efforts were carried out by the CIA and Western intelligence agencies to carry out, to foment rebellion in Ukraine using the followers of Stefan Bandera. And they went nowhere, but there was it went well into the 50s. The supplies and personnel would be parachuted in, and the Soviets clamped down on it, but it was there, and it came back to life after the fall of the Soviet Union, and when Ukraine gained its independence in 1991, it was a very small minority. I think the great majority of Ukrainian citizens, including those in the West, looked askance at them, but they have grown in power and influence over time. They've seized the leasing institutions. So their ideas, like their anti-Russian hatred, has become institutionalized. So now, like just the other day, I saw that a town in Western Ukraine was going to hire a Russian language inspector, basically a monitor, somebody to go around to make sure nobody's speaking Russian. That's the kind of
creepy.
Yeah, right. But
crazy.
Long before we got to that point, there were efforts to ban the Russian language. It even preceded 2014. And it was because of the influence of these people, the extreme nationalists associated with Stefan Bandera, and they began putting up statues to him. And then, when they had the elections, it's true. People will point out, well, they only got 2% of the vote. But the problem is, that's a highly organized and heavily armed 2%. So they ended up having an outsized influence on the government, which you can see to this day. And they really have taken over much of the government. So there are top leaders that are clearly Banderites, and their ideology is now is become the ideology of the regime. Now, Poland is always up for obvious reasons. Though Poland has been a fervent supporter of Ukraine throughout this conflict, since 2022, they haven't forgotten, what happened to them. They haven't forgotten their history. And recently, the former foreign minister Kulebra, of Ukraine, had made some comments about, well, I can't remember the details, but he brought this up again in a way that greatly displeased the Poles. There was no apology, but actually a celebration, again, of Bandera and his people. And the Poles demanded an apology. So there is these sore points between the Poles and the Ukrainians, over the history, which the Poles will not forget. And then also, there's so many Ukrainian refugees poured into Poland, and my understanding that it's actually created quite a bit of friction, and now they're not so welcome. And then I think there always has been, let's say, an anti-intervention, anti-war wing of Polish politics. It never went away. But hopefully what we saw there is a sign that they're growing in strength and gaining popular support. That would be in line with what we're seeing in the rest of Western Europe, like what happened in Germany, where clearly the anti-war vote was very strong, to the point that Olaf Scholz, I think, is changing his tunes because he realized that what he's doing is very unpopular. Poland may not be as far as Germany, but there's reasons to hope that they're going down the same trajectory towards a more, anti-war, anti-interventionist position.
Yeah, it seems like it's the Brits more than anybody that want this to happen, want NATO intervention into Ukraine. There's talks constantly about trying to send troops there from the Brits, trying to give them more and more capabilities.
And apparently they were, very heavily involved in the Kursk invasion. And in fact, a lot of the soldiers that took part in that invasion were trained in Great Britain. That a lot of, there was a story that came out quite recently, a lot of training facilities are not available to British soldiers because so many of them have been handed over to the Ukrainians. It gives you an idea of the extent of the British involvement in this. Yes, it's irrational. It's hard to understand. They don't have the means. In a way, I mean, they do have a good intelligence service. They just don't have the weapons, but they have this connection to the U.S. and so they're constantly pressuring the U.S. to go farther and taking the lead on different things. Most recently, the whole question of whether or not restrictions will be lifted on missiles for long-range strikes into Russia.
Do you know what the status of that is? It seems, I've been reading some news headlines that said from the Russian side saying that NATO is prepping their populations for this. That these stories are breaking out, letting it know, so that way the decisions essentially already been made, and they're just kind of piecemealing it out to the population so it doesn't startle people too much.
Yeah.
It's true how you do these. If you're kind of not paying attention that closely, you're distracted by the election here in the United States or just your day-to-day life, and these gradual incremental changes start going on, and you don't realize, hey, whoa, this war is way different than it was when we first started 2 years ago.
Yeah. What
we're talking about.
Right.
And all of a sudden we're in the thick of it. And so it seems like what I showed you in the beginning, hopefully, I think, is a response to this decision that seems to have been made, and we'll see if it actually gets pushed through, is that some countries are like, this is getting real now. So has there been a decision made firmly on whether or not this is going to happen, or does it look like it is?
It's not at all clear. I mean, okay, first, as I said a couple programs ago, right, it looked like the U.S. was holding the line. They were. I mean, they were. I think the Pentagon in particular was remaining firm in spite of kind of a full court press that Zelensky's PR team put on them. They just, they even sent a delegation to Washington. They brought it up again at the Ramstein conference, but the response again was no, no, no. So I found that very encouraging. But then we heard this news that Tony Blinken said, well, this is something that we need to go and talk to. I think this is a step that needs to be taken. He obviously was contradicting what the Pentagon was saying. And then he went directly to Kiev with Lamy, the British foreign minister. And it looked like, and when they were there, you started to get rumors that, okay, the restrictions have been lifted. They now have permission to strike into pre-2014 Russian territory, with ATACMS, with Storm Shadows, with Scout missiles, and, maybe with this JSAM. Or that's, you got that rumors. Then it started to get walked back a little bit. It says, well, actually, okay, the U.S. is allowing the UK and France to use their weapons, but the Ukrainians will not be able to use U.S. weapons for this. And then the most recent report that I heard is that the whole thing has been put on hold, and they're not. The restrictions may not be lifted after all. One thing is that throughout the Russians have been crystal clear. Putin, Lavrov, and then there was a Russian representative of the UN, all said that if they take this step, then there's just no question that NATO will be attacking Russia directly. They're not providing any wiggle room, and we need to respond appropriately. Now, I think important, Putin gave a very detailed response, and he said just that. But, he says our response will be calibrated depending on the extent of the damage. If it's major, like if a missile actually strikes and destroys a building in Moscow, or I think the response just has to be major. If it's minor, again, it's just that it takes out one plane at an air base or something. Well, again, we have to respond to that, but it will be a calibrated response. We'll respond appropriately. I guess we don't sink a whole ship or something for that. But he said that we will. They are saying that this is a red line, and a lot of these other things that sometimes we say, obviously the Russians, we always cross the red lines. Well, those weren't actually Russian red lines. Maybe they gave warnings, said that we shouldn't do this, but they hadn't really laid it down. They've made it real clear that this is a red line. And, right. and maybe again, with their forceful reassertion, and maybe there's some, again, like things going on beyond the scenes as reminders, say, hey, if you do this, you're going to lose a ship or something, or you're going to, the Houthis are going to get one thing or the other, or we're going to strike a base in Romania or something. Who knows what they're saying. And they're saying, we're not kidding. And maybe that's causing them to walk it back. It's something that they've tried to do before. If you remember, I think it was way back, it was several months ago that the previous British foreign minister and also Cameron, right? That he started talking about this, and then he was actually like the British ambassador was called in and given a dressing down, and after that they just walked it back. So I think again it's just like maybe they were hoping for some sort of Russian weakness this time, and the Russians showed no signs of bending on this, and they may just say, okay, hey, we can't do this. We'll see. Let's hope. I mean, right now it was looking really bad 2 days ago, and now it's looking more hopeful. But there's clearly a real battle going on behind the scenes. There are the Blinkens, that on one side, they just don't seem to are very completely reckless and just don't seem to grasp the dangers involved. And it seems like, again, it's the military people on the other side and the intelligence in this case.
Right. Yeah, this is such a major step, and it's a shame that most people have no idea what's happening. Like, I just saw an interview with Putin this morning, might have been from yesterday, and he was basically saying, what we're talking about, that if these missiles are launched into Russia, these cannot be operated by Ukrainian servicemen. This is NATO servicemen that are operating this weaponry, firing into Russia, that means that NATO is at war with Russia. That's a huge thing. And he said that this fundamentally changes the essence of the conflict, like laying it out in very clear terms. And when I heard it coming from Putin himself, watching, I'm like, wow, this is serious. We really need to think about this. Right. But the thing is, very few people get to see that or hear that. Putin's always saying things very clearly about what he's doing and why he's doing it and what the red lines are and how to avoid it. But the Western world ignores it. And if you just even listen to Putin or like Tucker Carlson talk to him, they automatically say you're just carrying water for Putin. Instead of just having the very rational response, it's like, well, this is the largest nuclear armed power in the world, and maybe we should listen to him before we do something stupid and irreversible like a nuclear war and the end of the world. But it's a shame that Western media just covers that up. We won't ever hear it, won't ever see it.
Right. They'll say something. They'll take something that Putin said out of context and play scary music and say Putin's making threats. They don't give the 2 minutes beforehand where he's saying, hey, if NATO does this, they're attacking Russia directly. It's just like, again, people in the West, most people are just completely unaware of this whole issue. It's just, for them, it's just a question of fairness. Well, why can't they strike, send their missiles into Russia? If Russia, okay, well, if the Ukrainians were making their own missiles, they would have a point, but it's not. These are Western missiles and more importantly, Western operated. So there would be a Western attack on Russia. That's the problem. And it just very rarely gets through. The thing is, the public may not know about it, but you can be sure that these governments are hearing about it and understanding what's going on. So hopefully sanity will prevail.
Right. The thing is, if NATO does do this, we start launching missiles in, and even if NATO brings troops into, there's no Article 5 initiation, right? If there are countries like, Slovakia or Poland, Turkey, Italy, that don't want to be involved in this conflict, then they don't need to be, right?
Right.
Like, I don't know. That's the thing. I think the hard part for people like Blinken and the UK is they may want to do this, but they may not be able to. There's not, the willpower isn't there. The willpower is there, but the people aren't willing. The populations aren't willing. Europe doesn't want to do this.
Right. It's the certain elite factions are hankering for war, but it's just not. It's true. It's not true of the voters. Yeah. Well, one thing, with Article 5, it's not automatic. First of all, it's just like if a NATO nation is attacked anyway, then all of them have to respond. That's not the way it goes. But, that nation can invoke Article 5 and request help. But the thing is, the understanding is that it's supposed to be an unprovoked attack. And if the Russians, make clear, look, this is in response to your attack on us. You attacked our territory, you, NATO. Now we're attacking your territory. I mean, they would be within their rights to do it. Maybe, again, that Putin doesn't want to give him any kind of excuse. But logically, he would be correct, and it would be something that a lot of NATO countries who do not want to get involved in a war with Russia would point out and say, hey, you're invoking Romania or Poland or whatever, you're invoking Article 5, but the truth is they're responding to a NATO attack. So it's not valid. That's sanity. You just hope the sanity prevails, but it may not. And so I'm sure that Putin would be very reluctant to give the crazies an opportunity to bring in NATO troops. So I think it's probably more likely that he would operate, I'm just guessing, but through a proxy like the Houthis.
Okay.
It's not fair to call him a proxy, but let's say an ally or a friendly allied force. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we won't talk too much about this because we covered it pretty extensively last podcast. But can you maybe just touch really quickly before we move on just about the current mood of European countries? We mentioned that Scholz seems to be getting cold feet on this whole Ukraine war. Yeah. We just saw the video from the Polish MEP. Are we seeing a significant shift now that maybe the news of these missile strikes have really kind of opened the eyes to a lot of people in Europe and said, like, hey, this is getting too real.
Yeah, I don't know if the news of what these missile strikes would entail, whether that is having an effect or has gotten through to the populations. But there's just been I think a steady shift ever since February 2022 against intervention or even support for Ukraine. It's just that it's gone on for a long time. It's obviously cost Europe terribly. The economic sanctions, is the countries that are paying the price of the economic sanctions on Russia are the European countries. And a lot of Europeans understand that. A lot of European businesses understand that. We're looking at a possible closure of Volkswagen factories. That's enormous. It really would be the end of the old Germany. So in Germany in particular, but not just Germany, in France and whatever, we see all kinds of signs of a growing disenchantment with the elite policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. And the recent German elections in Thuringia and I guess it was Saxony, the anti-establishment parties did extremely well, especially in Thuringia. Like in Thuringia, it was they got better than half. We're talking about the off day, the right-wing party, but then the left party, or Wagenknecht's party. And they're both solidly, against support for Ukraine. And it's clear that, I think Scholz is responding to that. He's nothing of not a political animal. I mean, he's been on board with it, with the establishment doing everything they want, but he sees his party is paying a huge price because of this. And so he's starting to walk things back. It's clear that he's trying to, I don't know how sincere he is, but he realized that this is costing his party and his allies really, in electoral terms, and that so he's starting to try to co-opt the opposition and start to talk peace. And I wouldn't trust him, but it shows that he's under pressure, and I'm sure you're finding that throughout Europe. Now it was true that like the elections in France also showed the same tendency. We had Mélenchon, a leftist party, is again opposed to support for Ukraine. And of course the National Rally is, and the two of them together did very, very well. But just through these machinations, Macron has managed to hang on to power, even though he's very unpopular, and he continues to prosecute his wildly pro-Ukraine policies. But it's against the very much in the teeth of the opposition of the popular.
It's against the will of the people.
Yeah.
But it's very reassuring to see that the will of the people seems to be against this conflict.
Yeah, it certainly is more sensible than what we see in the elites. And the elites can't ignore these. I mean, they do things. Obviously, they play these games like Macron play, and I think Schultz is trying to play some game. He's bound to lose, but maybe like the Christian Democrats they'll probably end up on top, and they'll talk out of their side of their mouths and try to kind of maybe modify their positions. But I doubt that they would do anything significant. But it just shows they are feeling pressure, and at some point they do have to respond.
Do you think when this is all said and done, if we avoid World War III and this conflict just ends, with a negotiated settlement, Russia's clearly got what it's wanted, it's over, do you think that the blame for all the death and destruction and the destroyed economies in Europe will be laid at the feet of the Americans, and rightfully so? And that this could be kind of a chance for Europe to orient itself more towards the East. Because really, if you look at it, that makes way more sense for the Europeans. You get, natural resources and cheap gas from Russia. They are on the same continent as you as well. You share a land mass. And also with the Chinese, the manufacturing belt. You've tied yourself to the United States, but what has the United States done for you? They have made you subservient to the United States. And you are not able to pursue your own national interests anymore. You pursue the national interest of apparently just Tony Blinken. It doesn't seem to be in the interest of the United States. And it just wreaks death and destruction. Is this alliance with the United States? Partner yourself with this. So do you think after this is done, we'll see perhaps a real breakup within Europe, where Europe is like, "Ooh, the U.S. went too far. This is the United States war." That video I started this podcast out with, that's basically what it was. Blinken, go home.
Right.
We don't want you here. We don't want Polish people to die for your stupid war. And that should resonate with every European.
Right.
And
well, there's certainly the potential for it. It's just that the establishment in Europe is going to fight tooth and nail to hang on to power, and will and to maintain this relationship with the U.S. That unfortunately seems to be true. But yeah, there's reason to hope, again, because there are these obvious popular pressures, and there are parties like the AfD and National Rally and the Left Party. And then, can't forget, Viktor Orban and his party. And then, of course, that left-wing party left by Robert Fico in Slovakia. So there are forces that do want to change the course of Europe. They're there.
And they're popular in their own countries.
That's right. Exactly. They're actually quite popular. It's just because of elite machinations that, we're not seeing them come to power in places like Germany and France, to a lesser extent in Great Britain. So, there's the potential for it, but it's just the establishment means powerful, and they're gonna fight to the bitter end. They have the support of the U.S. So it's not going to be an easy fight. I mean, we could have the future that you're describing, and I hope, I hope that is the future of Europe, for Europe's sake. There's also a chance that they'll just circle the wagons and draw even closer to the U.S. and, and constantly bring up the Russian boogeyman and continue to crack down on populism, which is to really say, popular
democracy.
sentiment. It's just like the majority. They'll find new ways of staying in power and repressing dissent. I mean, that's the other possible dark future for Europe, is an increasingly repressive governments out of touch with their own people, and drawn in a very tight alliance with the U.S.
Well, I hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah,
I
no,
mean,
I hope. But you're right.
But that's the general trend that we're experiencing in this country as well, and in Europe. That we have to censor things, we have to control the narrative. We can't. We need to preserve the hegemon. Like you said, circle the wagons. That's the initial response, but the ability to do it in the modern age, I think, is a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
With things like thank Elon Musk for really opening things up for a lot of Western Europe. I don't know where a lot of people. Just imagine if we didn't have the internet, and some free speech platforms, people wouldn't be able to hear what we're talking about.
Right.
That's the thing that just makes it so scary, that I feel like there is going to be some type of civil war in one of these Western European countries, the United States, at some point. If we avoid all-out war, we still have the dangers within our own countries, because there are two different realities that are being absorbed by the populations. There are people that are watching the mainstream media and listening to the elites of their countries just spoon feed them propaganda, and then there's the other half of the population that have gone off of mainstream media and are exploring alternative news sources and getting a completely different reality, which is the real reality.
Yeah.
Sometimes,
you find all kinds of things too. I mean, you can go off in many when you stop believing in the mainstream, it doesn't necessarily mean that you know what the truth is. I mean, some of them just go off, and in the U.S. you can point to the MAGA cult. It's just that, it's just Trump. I think a lot of those people have their hearts in the right place, but Trump is not the answer. I mean, he just isn't. He's not. But for them, he is. So you get these different kinds of phenomena. Not all dissent is actually factually based. We'll just put it that way.
Right. Yeah. I think I mentioned this the other day, but I feel like I prefer Kamala, just because I know that Trump can't save the United States in the way a lot of people can. The only reason I really like Trump is he's kind of gives a middle finger to the establishment and the ruling class. But he's going to get into power, and everything's going to fall apart under his watch, and everybody's going to blame Trump and blame conservatives or MAGA or whatever. It's like, really, that's not the issue. We're just on a sinking ship, and we're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, kind of thing. So it's like, let Kamala take it. This is Biden's war. Let her finish it out, and we've talked about this before. I believe we're both of the same mindset that there really isn't much to save the United States in its current form. It has to go through a kind of a complete restructuring, a total collapse. Do you still believe that?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean civil war or secession, though it could. It could, but it seems to me there has to be some really, let's say, the deep crisis. I mean, there is you could say a political crisis, but it's just a lot of people who don't pay attention to politics aren't really experiencing. If people who are following politics are seeing there is some kind of political crisis, there clearly is. It's and there may be wildly varying interpretations of it, but it's real. If you're on the Democratic left and you actually believe in the mainstream Democratic narrative, you think that Trump poses an existential threat to democracy. That this is not an exaggeration. It's what they're saying. It's what Kamala Harris is saying, and that January 6th was, in fact, an insurrection that very nearly overthrew our government and overturned an election. And so, if you're on the left, you're saying that this is we're in a deep political crisis. But if you're I won't say that you have to be on the right, because there are a lot of leftist dissidents from that narrative and don't buy it. Even people who can't stand Trump say that this is nonsense. And the problem really is the scary thing is the weaponization of, for example, the judiciary against a political opponent, and the prosecution of hundreds of citizens that really were guilty of nothing on January 6th. Some people that were actually ushered in by the police. We have tapes of that, and but are being threatened with years in jail, and some of them are in jail. This is sort of this is also a severe political crisis. This is a real threat to the American system. So it doesn't even matter which narrative you believe in. There is a political crisis going on. But for people who are not involved, they can still, they're noticing inflation. It's real. It's just obvious, even if you try to get some sort of denials or have it spun by, the establishment. It's real. And it just, every time you go to a McDonald's or the grocery store, you experience it. And very few of us are seeing a proportionate increase in our incomes. So people are suffering. But still, they don't know really who to blame for that. But if the crisis reaches some point, the economic crisis or the dollar really is kicked off its ruling roost, and we see hyperinflation or something, that's going to wake up to people and say, hey, there's something. This isn't just a kind of a rough economic period. This is a crisis. Something's wrong. People are going to wake up, and who knows where they're going to give their allegiance. But I think we're going to see a beginning of some sort of radical reconfiguration, and that could not be very far in the future. We'll see.
Do you think that the results of this election could trigger that in some type of revolt?
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah, I don't. I don't think there are enough people on the. People that are actually willing to go out on the streets on the Trump side, in spite of what you hear from the leftists. I don't see it happening. If there is something happens, if there is any kind of protest, it'll be greatly exaggerated and blown out of proportion, like I think January 6th was.
Well, if Trump wins, which I think is definitely
possible,
possible. I think maybe even likely. Who knows? But. Like we've talked about, you talked about the narrative on the left saying that this is an existential threat to democracy. Then,
right.
Well, what does that mean? And it's not that,
right.
Because then you have the institutions and they're the ones that have the ability. Sure, if Kamala gets back in power, you're right. I don't see conservative MAGA people really organizing and doing something. But if Trump comes in, then you got the CIA, you got Homeland Security, you got the FBI, you got the elite institutions that will go at war with the executive branch. And then that might lead to something, right?
Well, yeah. Well, I think, again, it's just, those are not my words. It's the words of, again and again, mainstream Democrats, that he presents an existential threat to democracy, not just to the Democratic Party. And if people believe that, and apparently they really do, or a number of them do anyway. We can see extra constitutional means employed, anywhere from an assassination to a coup to some sort of new Russia hoax, or who knows how to go about it. But we could see, I think, really further, really in the name of defending democracy, I think we'll see various measures taken that will severely damage democracy. I think that's almost certain if Trump wins.
Right. And then we'll see perhaps secessions from certain states, secession movements, potentially start to get a bit more mainstream. Yeah, there's a lot to look forward to next year as well. It's going to be a pretty interesting, rocky time. I mean, November's coming up fast. We just got a couple more months. I don't want to focus too much on the domestic, but it will. We are living here in the U.S., and there's just so many things to focus on in the world. I'm waiting for World War III to pop off in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I'm waiting for the Samson option and the Iranian retaliation, then a potential Samson option from the Israelis in the Middle East. And then we have civil war to look forward to here domestically. So it's like, I know, but just the possibility, just the fact of saying this and it not being like, blowing someone's mind outlandish. Like,
10 years
pitching
ago,
a movie
or even
script
5 years ago, or anyway, pre-Trump, it would just seem, absurd, just really silly stuff. And now it's no longer
right. And just the direction that things are going is just things just get more and more polarized. I'm not seeing any sign of unity and trying to understand the other side, where they're coming from, on any of these conflicts. It's just, doubling down, tripling down. So get your popcorn. We're going to have a lot of events coming up. 2025 is going to be, you thought 2024 was bad. I think wait for 2025.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go back over to the conflict. We've been talking a lot about Russia and Ukraine, but we haven't actually been talking about what's been happening on the front in the Donbass, where this war is going to be decided.
Yeah.
And the last update from about a week ago, we're talking about it. Russia is moving at an accelerating rate through the Donbass. So, and maybe moving towards the Dnieper. So maybe you can just give us an update of what's happening on the front and where you see it going.
Yeah. Well, it's that continues to be the case. It's really their advances have now shifted to different points. Actually, the forces that were directly approaching Pokrovsk, I should. The ones that were directly approaching Pokrovsk seem to have come pretty much to a stop. Not entirely, but just south of Pokrovsk, we've seen some major advances in some places where there had been very little movement, over the last several months. That all of a sudden the Russians have moved, taken many tens of square kilometers. One place is Krasnogorivka, which was I think they began to move into it in March, and then heard like even back in June, it sounded like they almost got it. The battle's almost over. And it was like there's only 10% remaining, but for whatever reason, I think the Ukrainians really dug in. Maybe they understood how it was a real linchpin, and for that last 10%, they really hung on. But just in this last week or so, the Russians drove them out completely. And when they did, there was a large area to the north of Krasnogorivka that they had to withdraw from. I mean, we're talking about something like 80 square kilometers. Is quite a bit. And then a little farther south, there is this, and it should be pointed out that Krasnogorivka was one of these fortress cities, like Avdiivka and Toretsk, which the Russians are entering and are taking neighborhoods every day, and they're moving at not at a rapid rate, but at a for the kind of fortress city that it is, they're going at a really pretty good rate into Donetsk and working on taking that city. And they've taken key positions, one of these slag heaps in a coal mine and a penal colony and industrial facilities. That's one of these things that makes these cities actually so hard to take, is they have these structures that really lend themselves to defense, and whoever gets a hold of them really has the advantage. And now they're seizing these key points within Toretsk. Okay, that's farther to the north, but down to the south there is this other fortress city called Ugledar. It's a small place, but it's high rises on the top of a hill, and you can almost think of it as just a kind of a modern castle, because that's what the Ukrainians turned it into. They occupied this hill and all these high rises as firing points. And a year ago, and even earlier, like a year and a half ago, the Russians tried to take it on a few occasions, and each time they were repulsed by the Ukrainians. But now they've advanced rapidly, and they've got it almost entirely encircled. And the days of Ugledar are clearly numbered. So that's a major point. Now, moreover, since they, I mentioned like to the north of Krasnogorivka, they're also advancing rather rapidly, to the west of it. There's another city called Kurikov, which is important, just to the south of a reservoir. And then farther up, closer, just south of Pokrovsk, there's a smaller city, maybe like 20,000, called Selidovi, I think it is. There's pronounced different ways. But the Russians are moving into that. And So anyway, there is movement all along, in these very important parts. It's stopped temporarily, right outside of Akros, but all these like Seludov to the south is actually a key um, um, settlement in relation to Akros. So they're positioning themselves to take the city, and they're actually now in the process of softening up points within the city, like taking out bridges that the Ukrainians were using for logistical supply and so on and so forth. They're clearly intent on taking Vokros, and when they do, that's really supposed to be the key city. It's the hub for the entire Donbass. The Ukrainians understood this. Because of their foolish adventure in the north in Kursk, they actually drew people away from Vokrovsk and some of these other places. Now, as they saw it falling apart, they sent some people back, but it's really too late. I think there's no question that the Russians are going to take it, and pretty quickly. Now, this is important. What's happening is, okay, the last fortress cities are falling. Krasnogorivka is one that's completely fallen. Avdiivka was the key one, of course. But as these cities fall, now, New York was taken, Toretsk is now being taken, and Ugledar is just, days away from being taken. And when all these are taken, there's that initial, you could say just a line of fortresses that the Ukrainians created over the course of several years, starting in 2014. That's gone. And then much of the secondary lines there have been taken. The Russians penetrated them. They went through from Ocheretino, and they've passed on. Now what now in Vokrovsk and some of the settlements nearby, the Ukrainians have dug in, but they haven't had the years to create, the bunkers and the firing points that they did in these other cities, the bunkers and tunnels and so on and so forth, that made those cities so hard to take. So they're defended, but they can't defend them the way they can. And then, of course, they're forces that are just weakening. They just don't have the manpower. They're running out of the equipment and ammunition. They have some fortifications here, but they're not weak. They're weak fortifications. So it seems to me there's just no question that Russia, over the next, few weeks, maybe at the most in the next few months, they're going to push through. And then after that, the landscape really changes. See, one thing is that the Donbass was so difficult is that it really, again, it was a landscape that really lent itself to fortifications, to defensive fortifications. There are a lot of these industrial facilities, like I mentioned, and mines and small waterways and hills and and high rises, and they used all of these things to just make sort of a kind of a 21st century Maginot Line, but one that actually worked pretty well. But the Russians are just mopping up, destroying the last of that. They've gone even past it and gone through the secondary lines that they had built up earlier, again, over the course of years. And now, okay, they have these temporary fortifications. They get past that. And then you get into the country beyond Vokrovsk, to the west of Vokrovsk and Vuhledar. And it's a different kind of country. It's just not it's not like the Eastern Donbass. And they just don't have the industrial facilities and the mines, not in anywhere the quantity that they do in the eastern part, and it's just going to be much more difficult to defend. So what I suspect is, like, when Vokrovsk falls, and Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, that's another place where the Russians are pushing forward, and I think all of these places are going to fall over the next few weeks and the next few months. Let's say by the end of the year. Then, if we're going to really see a real tipping point, it's already clearly starting to tip. We've seen a real acceleration, and the West is admitting that too. I just saw, a piece in the New York Times this morning, but that's going to be a real tipping point where I think we could see a real rapid advance all the way to the Dnieper, because it's just first of all, they just don't have the forces, but neither will they have the fortifications over there. It's just not possible to build up those places. They're the way that they were able to build up the Eastern Donbass. And so, again, that's when we could see the true the collapse. We're just seeing the beginnings of it. But I think when they get past Chasiv Yar, Vokrovsk, and Ugledar, that's when we're going to see the true collapse. And I don't think it's very far away because they're moving on, and it's just clear that the Ukrainians can slow them down, but they can't stop them in these places.
Right. So if you're guessing just a couple weeks, a month, and that this could happen.
Well,
I know it's hard.
Yeah, that would be a couple of weeks. I think no way, but at the sometimes we're surprised. It could at the most rapid, I would say a month, and then maybe if they just like they pour in everything they've got to stop them, it could be something like 4 months. I don't know. Again, the Russians aren't going to. They conserve their own manpower. So if they see the Ukrainians just pouring in the last of their troops in these places, again, we mentioned that saying from Clausewitz: when you see your enemy making a mistake, don't stop them. Right? They say, okay, just let them do this, and we'll just chew them up, and then they won't have anything left. Right. So but it could delay things by a couple months.
Right. I'm always kind of surprised about how long some of the things it takes for a collapse to happen. When things are clearly not going well, but the fight continues, and we've talked about this in historical context. Like the Germans in World War II. When they clearly were it lost the war, it just kept on going for another year, and they even did some offenses like the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive. So these things can drag out, but I also do think that we are getting to a point where the morale is so low, right? If you are polling, we see these videos every day of Ukrainian men being pulled off the streets, right. and I hear they have maybe 2 weeks of training, which is nothing, and then they're thrown to the front, and they're losing upwards of 2,000 casualties a day. They're really scratching. The morale has to be rock bottom. I also heard there's a Ukrainian female MP or female Rada member, I forget her name. She's been making a lot of noise. She's actually been visiting, going into Eastern Ukraine and saying like, hey, we've been given all this money and all this equipment. Where is it? Where are the fortifications? You haven't sown any minefields. So like you're saying, once they break past this, there's really nothing left. They can just kind of, there will be pockets of resistance, I'm sure, but they can start to steamroll as soon as they break through these final fortifications here in the eastern Donbass. All these cities.
Right.
Yeah. This is unrelated, but just I find it weird that all these cities in Ukraine, we have Krasnogorkov, Ocheretno, Prokrovsk, and then there's New York. Am I getting trolled? Why is New York in there? Right?
Pokrovsk, yeah, right. Yeah, sure. I keep on mispronouncing it, but
I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. But I'm always struggling with these names. And
I don't know why. It's actually not. It's actually a very. Some of these names are rather difficult. That's not one. But for some reason, I always pronounce it incorrectly.
Pokrovsk, well, the one that always stands out to me is like New York. It's like, why is New York here? Right. All these names are so difficult.
Right. It was actually named by the Ukrainians. So I believe that the Russians have changed the name back to Novgorod, which just means new city.
I will remember it as New York. Okay. Well, it's this is okay. We're coming close to getting close to the end game. This is also the most dangerous part. The end game is the most dangerous. Like we've said before, this will be the moment of truth. Once these last few fortification cities fall in the eastern Donbass, and then there's open roads in front of the Russians, that's when we could have NATO, Blinken begin to panic and do something stupid.
Well, I think they're actually already beginning to panic. I mean, the fact that we've heard this, Blinken saying that, we got to lift the restrictions, and we're getting this push from the British too. I think the reason that they're making this push is that they're just desperate and they really run out of ideas. Now, this is something that's not going to solve their problems for them, but they just, they say, well, what else can we do? We got to do something. That's their thinking. It's just clear. I mean, they've continually escalated. And I think just the fact that they continually escalated tells you that they miscalculated at the beginning. They thought that they were going to defeat Russia, relatively quickly, that the economic war was going to succeed, that the Russian army was weak and would be, easily defeated and demoralized. And they were wrong. They were wrong about all these things. And so that's why they're changing, when you're talking about escalation, they're changing their own policies. They keep on doing it because they committed themselves to a policy that has failed. And so they're just going to keep on escalating or trying to, maybe they're finally hitting the ceiling where the realists in the defense departments are just saying, no, we cannot do this. I'm sorry. The fact that they're trying shows a growing panic. There is a growing panic within the Western elite.
From a military strategic point of view, what we've done has just been so stupid with this Ukraine war, because not only have we expended a huge portion of NATO munitions and stockpiles by providing to Ukraine, but we have been piecemealing them bit by bit to the Ukrainians, and we've seen Russia learn to how to counter every single weapon we have.
Right.
And we're doing it at a slow, because we're not, maybe if we went out an all-out blitz and used all of our real super fancy weapons right in the beginning, that you don't have any time to adapt and you knock out all of the Russian command centers or whatever it is, and then boom, playing victory. But here it's like, all right, here's the HIMARS.
Yeah,
Russia slowly will give you 20 rockets. You send some samples into Russia, and Russia can spend
Russia
some time.
Great,
thanks for sending these in. We'll take a look at how to dismantle this piece of equipment, the best way to destroy it, the best way to neutralize it through electronic warfare. And we've done that with every single weapon. And now it's like, what do we have left? It's like, and now we're going to give them the next one, JSAM. All right. I think, I forget who said it takes the Russians 2 weeks now to when a new weapon is used for them to effectively neutralize it. Right. And I think they're getting...
So it made them a lot stronger. And then that they're...
made ourselves so much weaker. That's the thing I think people don't realize.
And the Russians are passing the information on to the Chinese. So, I mean, though they're not making attackams are really an important part of the U.S. arsenal. And that was one reason they were reluctant to give them to the Ukraine is they wanted to conserve them for possible use in the China region, in the South China Sea. But now, they have fewer of them, and that the Chinese know how to neutralize them too. I mean, this is a huge blow to the U.S. military. This is, essentially, you've strengthened, you kind of it's almost like you couldn't design a better way of strengthening the Russian army. It's just, introducing a weapon at a time, giving them a few weeks to figure it out. And then you go on to the next weapon, they figure that one out, they neutralize that.
Right. And just the rise of just nationalism within Russia, because they're so clearly wronged here that they are, the recruitment numbers for the Russian military have been going up consistently every month. Every single time NATO and the U.S. does something else, more provocations, then it just causes more and more Russian young men to stand up and be like, no, I'm going to defend Mother Russia. And they're now the whole idea
that you would destabilize Russia and that you would strengthen anti-Putin forces. The only anti-Putin forces that you're strengthening are the ones that are to the nationalist side of him, to the not even necessarily the nationalist right. There's a nationalist left to the Communist Party. There is sometimes a frustration in general. Russian society and the Russian government is clearly solidly behind him. But if there's any frustration, it's not with the fact that he's prosecuting this war, but that he's doing it so cautiously. That's the only thing. The only hand you're strengthening that leftist or Western leaning faction within the Russian government and politics, thanks to all these measures that the sanctions and all the Russophobia that you see in the West, that is almost gone. It used to be a real force. I mean, it didn't count for much in numbers, but they, a lot of those people were wealthy. There were, some of the so-called oligarchs were very strongly Western leaning, and then there were groups within the government that were very pro-Western, and they're just almost gone. And it was thanks to the efforts of the West. I mean, everything they did was to strengthen nationalism in Russia and strengthen their army
and their economy.
Even their economy, incredibly. I think even to the amazement of the Russians themselves.
Right. Yeah, I just can't think of a worse debacle in military history, military strategy in the history of the world. I mean, this whole everything from start to finish or to present now. It's just
Right. Again, you wouldn't know it if you were just reading, following the mainstream media. The reports are coming out about how grim it is on the front lines for the Ukraine, even in very pro-Ukraine Western mainstream media like The Economist and CNN. We are getting these reports, but but a lot of people who don't read The Economist or and just look at their, Google News feed or whatever appears on Facebook, they're still thinking that the Ukrainians are doing incredible things in Kursk. And obviously at some point that whole narrative is going to collapse. But it still exists amazingly, in spite of all the reality. The reality is seeping in at the higher levels, again, the intelligence agencies and the defense departments and some of the, the more intelligent media starting to seep in. Actually, they're saying things that we on the, people in the dissident media have been saying for 2 years, and now they're finally starting to admit them, within the mainstream media. Not fully, but they're starting to admit them. But again, for the average Joe consumer of news, he has no awareness of this. Well, it's got to hit him in the face at some point. There's some point where you can't. The narrative just won't be supportable any longer. Maybe it's when, like, after Pokrovsk, right, collapses and they start marching towards the Dnieper or something like that. There will be some point where you just can't hide it anymore.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, just for personal vindication, because there's just so many people out there that are just constantly going on how Russia's on its last leg. They've expended 90% of their military. They're about to collapse. It's insane. It's crazy how, and I'm like, whoa, where are you? Where are you getting your sources from?
Yeah.
I'm in a different world. And they always say history is written by the victors. So Russia is going to be victorious here. They will get to write the history. But I wonder how long it takes for that to really...
Yeah, I think that, obviously when, Russia is going to win this war, is winning this war and will win it. Again, it may not be a pretty victory, like Mearsheimer says. I think it could be a very ugly victory, but clearly they're going to win it. But when that happens, there will be the spin machines will go on. If they say, well, okay, yeah, too bad, half of Ukraine is gone or whatever. But the Russians wanted to take all of Ukraine. So basically it's a victory for Ukraine. Of course, the Russians never said that they wanted to take all of Ukraine. And in fact, if you looked at the agreement that they had made with the Zelensky government at the very beginning of the conflict, they were willing to give him everything, even the Donbass, right? If he agreed to neutrality and respect the rights of Russian, ethnic Russians there. They only were going to insist on holding on to Crimea. Now that's all gone. But, the spin machine will go and they'll say somehow, I don't think people will find it all that convincing because they're going to remember it's like, this is not what we were being promised. And Zelensky we're always talking about marching to Crimea. But they'll try, and they might even succeed with some people who have very short memories.
But it'll succeed with a lot of people, more than you think.
Yeah,
that's the problem. That's the problem. Is it's
a lot of people just live in the moment and they just even forget what they were told 6 months ago.
Yeah, or there's an absolute refusal to admit that they were wrong or to change their mind. They can't bring themselves to do it. I mean, you see it on so many different things, and just the hypocrisy. I mean, just like COVID, I think is a great example. How everybody just that now that where we are now, we should be able to look back on that whole COVID experience and be like, okay, we made some real mistakes here on some of these lockdowns, on forcing these boosters, not doing the right studies. There's obviously interests were corrupted, but a huge amount of the population just will never admit that there was anything really wrong about it and continue to just to stay in that path. And they may be like that forever. So I think with this, something like the Ukraine war, with the spin machine, it's easy to hold on to your narrative, what you want to believe, and I think it will be difficult.
Yeah, but the thing is, it won't work for most of the world. Just like it's already not working. That most of the world will see how the Russians beat NATO, and maybe within NATO countries they can convince themselves, the segment of the population that this didn't happen, but the rest of the world's going to look at it and say, "Wow, the Russians defeated NATO."
And it's in such a sure way. They didn't even have to go that hard. I feel like it.
There was never a total mobilization. And, that was, again, a criticism from a lot of people within Russia. Felt like, Ukraine should have, that
Russia.
Putin should have gone to the Russian people and said, look, to win this war, we need to totally mobilize. We're going to have to tighten our belts. And, there's going to be some economic hardship, but we just got to do this. He actually never did that and has managed to really insulate the Russian economy from the war. And the vast majority of Russian people, again, your sister's in Moscow, and, she has Russian coworkers and Russian friends, and like nobody knows anybody that's been, first of all, conscripted. The mobilization was in the fall of 2022, and it was only 300,000 people. It was from reservists. So nobody even knows anybody that was mobilized at that time. They don't even know anybody that knows anybody that's signed up in Moscow. It's like the only story that she's heard about. Okay, somebody who knew somebody that did sign up. This was a co-workers from the Tula region, which is, I believe, where people are kind of ethnically similar to the Mongols, and Buddhism is their religion by and large there. And they're very, very patriotic, very strong supporters of Putin and the Russian government. And she said, like, she knew a bunch of like high school, these young men who were really excited about joining the Russian army. So as soon as they graduated and they were of legal age to sign up, they just went there as a group and they all signed up. He said, send us to the front. And like 2 weeks later, they got kicked out because apparently they had some wild party in the barracks, and the Russians just said, you guys are clearly not ready for this, and just sent them home. So anyway, it shows, if anything, this is not an army that's just desperate for soldiers.
Well, and you juxtapose it to what's happening in Ukraine, and it's just horrific. These people that are just being pulled off the streets. Yeah, no, you can't write a more humiliating debacle and defeat for NATO. And like, let's be honest, this is NATO. We say like, if all of NATO is in, NATO has given a ton, of everything in. Not only have we allowed them to piecemeal the use of the weapons that they can neutralize it, we look at what's happened to Russia. The Russian economy is stronger than ever. It has a greater position in the world. It is now has, I think, another 37 countries have signed up to join BRICS Plus. It is leading the new multipolar world. And its army is stronger than ever. Like you're saying, we're getting more and more people signing up for the Russian military every single month. Since this thing has started, it's just getting bigger and stronger and more capable. And it's just like, what were we thinking? What was NATO doing? What were we thinking?
It's a huge intelligence failure. There's no question about it. I mean, this is really you would hope that heads would roll and there would be a reassessment. Unfortunately, it just seems like, again, a lot of our institutions have been corrupted. And these people just who maintain power, they maintain power by just saying what the leaders want to hear. And as long as that's the way things work, there's just not going to be any improvement. We're going to have future intelligence failures.
Right. I mean, Russia is going to single-handedly defeat all of NATO without breaking a sweat, effectively.
Yeah. Well, I would say they broke a sweat. I mean, there's, clearly tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed. We don't really know what it could be over 100,000. We don't know. So it's serious.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, just in the grand scheme of things, though, I mean, just,
right.
Like you're saying, Peggy, our sisters in Moscow.
Yeah, the vast majority of Russians don't, right. They just, they don't feel it.
Right.
They're not feeling the effects of the war. Nobody's, when we were there, the only thing you saw, the occasional billboard, but that was it. I mean, it's not a militarized society. People are going about their business and there's business is humming.
And Europe is collapsing, it's, and the U.S.
Yeah. Germany is deindustrializing, right?
It's crazy. It really is such an insane thing. It'll be interesting telling my boys about this period in history. The dumbest leadership, dumbest military strategist in the history of the world.
Yeah.
I feel like if you just played video games, you would know better than this.
Right. If you put the average gamer in charge, would have come out with a better outcome than this. Yeah.
Right,
No,
right.
Well, it's a proof, again, I think, of some very corrupt institutions, intelligence, political. It's just that these kind of decisions this bad aren't made, by clear-eyed who are engaging in sound analysis. Obviously there was just the analysis had been politicized. We'd heard warnings about that from like XCI guys for years and years. And it's clearly true. I mean, it's these agencies have been politicized and therefore corrupted.
Okay, well, I think we can end it there. I mean, just the last thing I'll say is, we're not out of the woods yet. The U.S. still has nukes. We could see what happens when the things really start to collapse. Things are looking like there's no way for Ukraine to win this thing, and this is where maybe a stupid decision gets made. So let's hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, that's right. Again, you can see the desperation. That's why we had that trip by Lammy and Tony Blinken. It may be that was the last gasp, but it may be that we're going to see even stronger effort on the part of the neocons, to expand, to escalate to increasingly dangerous levels. We'll see. I think we probably will see efforts. I think there's no question. I just hope that they fail.
Yeah, I feel like Blinken has become kind of the de facto president of the United States now.
Yeah.
It's just...
At least for foreign policy, yeah.
Right. Okay, anyways, let's call it a day. We'll end it there. All right, Dad, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
All right.